Okay, so here's what happened. This started off as a review of Bram Stoker's Dracula on Super Nintendo. Thought I'd get into the spirit of Halloween one last time before October was over. I wanted to give this one a legitimate chance, but all I could think of when I was playing is how this game is just a poor man's Castlevania, but with clunkier weapons, shorter levels that all look the same, and enemies that are repetitive and uninspired, not to mention boss fights that are ridiculously easy. Seriously? Then my game notes got deleted and I decided, you know what, let's just do Super Castlevania IV instead. So here we go, Super Castlevania IV, developed and released by Konami in 1991. If you're looking for a Super Nintendo game to play this Halloween, you really can't go wrong with this one. The story is actually something of a reimagining of the first Castlevania on NES. The story takes place in 1691 Transylvania, where you take up the mantle as Simon Belmont, a member of the Belmont family tasked with defeating the evil Dracula. Every 100 years, Dracula comes back and wreaks havoc, and every time the Belmonts have defeated him. It's been 100 years, and once again, the Belmonts have to step up and banish Dracula from this world. But what makes this game so great? Well, for starters, the play control really is the best in the series. It's definitely my favorite. Controlling Simon's movements feels effortless, and you can swing the whip around in pretty much all directions. If you hold down the attack button, you can also hold the whip out and then sort of fling it around like kind of a flail. This attack is weaker, but super helpful, especially if you're in a sticky situation and miss the first time. It kind of gives you a chance to redeem yourself, and you can use it to take out projectiles or whatever. I never understood why they did away with this in subsequent games in the series. You can also control Simon a little better mid-air during a jump, unlike the first Castlevania where if you jump, that's just kinda it. And you can swing from these hooks with your whip, catch yourself on the staircases, and even moonwalk a little bit. The levels are all fantastically drawn, and each one is different or unique in its own way. Everything just looks awesome, from undead-infested forests, dreary caves, complex castle interiors, epic scenes with bridges cast against a foreboding moonlight, clouds sometimes moving beneath the very platforms you stand on. Dracula's castle and the surrounding countryside never looked better. They also made clever use of Super Nintendo's Mode 7 capabilities with levels that rotate or swirl around like the inside of a dryer. This level with all the gold inside Dracula's castle reminds me of Scrooge McDuck. Check out these huge swinging chandeliers. You have to make your way across these without falling off. Even the flames on the candles dance against the motion of the chandeliers. They really outdid themselves here, and in places the walls even seem to be watching you. Although the levels are pretty much linear, they still provide unique challenges like moving platforms, cogs that chase you up the tower, and with these moving hooks you'll be hanging on for dear life. The enemies are all fun as well. Bats, skeletons, dripping eyeballs to cursed knights, they're incredibly detailed. All of this creates a spooky atmosphere that genuinely takes you back to the monster movies these games are all a loving tribute to. And then there's the boss fights. Medusa, mummies, water dragons, Frankenstein's monster, giant Mode 7 rock monsters, and even the Grim Reaper makes a cameo. And you can collect special weapons and power-ups by whipping these candles you find along the way, similar to Ninja Gaiden. Knives, axes, holy water, although for the most part I always stick with the boomerang cross, and who doesn't? If you defeat enough enemies using your special, you'll get a special power-up that lets you fire 2 or 3 at a time. You'll pretty much always want to save these up for the boss fights because although near the beginning the bosses aren't too challenging, they get downright brutal in the later stages, and you want every advantage you can get. The Grim Reaper in particular is one of the hardest bosses I've ever encountered. So, this game is definitely challenging, but I never feel like the challenge is unfair. Unlike the first game where you have to deal with genuinely unfair knockback deaths and Medusa heads that knock you off ledges, this game has just the right balance of being challenging without being overly frustrating. I will say the difficulty ramps up significantly in some of the later stages with monsters that take a lot of damage to beat while also dishing out tons of damage on their own. Thankfully, there's a bountiful harvest of pork chops conveniently located in the numerous walls around Transylvania to replenish your health. They also threw in some tough platforming elements that require some pretty precise timing in later stages. But if you can manage to make it this far, the last couple of levels are a loving tribute to the original Castlevania, with some very familiar looking levels, and an already wonderful soundtrack gets even better with some 16-bit remixes of those oh so familiar tunes. Finally, if you can somehow make it through all of that, you get to face Dracula in the final showdown. He's tough, but if you're willing to take a leap of faith, you'll get some help from above. This is one of my all-time favorite SNES games. I still remember buying it when it first came out. I didn't really know what to expect, and mostly just bought it because I loved the box art. I had rented Simon's Quest a few times and never got very far because I never really knew what I was supposed to be doing. And I never got a chance to spend much time with the other NES Castlevania games until much later. So for me, this was probably my first definitive Castlevania game that I got a chance to sit down and play all the way through. So seeing the game through that lens, I guess I'm able to appreciate the simple brilliance of it a little better than someone who may be experiencing it for the first time today, having played most of the other games that came out later in the series. I've heard some complaints that this game felt like a step backwards from Castlevania III at the time. Part 3 had branching levels and multiple playable characters that you could choose from. I understand that criticism, but I feel like by focusing on one character and a linear path, it gave the designers a chance to just make a really good, straightforward platforming action adventure rather than trying to do too much. Yes, every time you play the game, it's going to be the same thing, but that's okay because that one thing is really, really good. Plus, if you need an additional challenge, stick around after the credits where you can play through the game a second time with more enemies and increased difficulty. And I understand it may feel like a step backwards if you're playing through this very linear game after having played through Symphony of the Night, which introduces the non-linear Metroidvania playstyle, but again, I would say just focus on what this game is rather than what it isn't. It's a perfect blend of platforming and action-adventure combined with an engrossing spooky setting and an excellent soundtrack. It's easily one of the best Super Nintendo games ever made. What did you think? Did you play this one growing up or maybe discover it recently? What was your all-time favorite Castlevania game? As always, thank you for watching. Please don't text and drive, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.